In the summer of 1717, about 1,000 pirates controlled a harbor the British Empire had given up on. They elected their captains. They could fire them by vote, and they split their plunder under written contracts that paid a man for a lost arm. Merchants from Charleston to Jamaica begged London for protection, and London had none to send. The men of Nassau called themselves the Flying Gang, and for a moment they ran the only society on earth built entirely by outlaws. That was 1717. By Christmas of 1718, 8 of them were swinging from a gallows on that same waterfront. This is how a pirate republic was born, and how it died. If you had asked anyone in London about New Providence in 1706, they would have told you the island was a failure. A small English colony in the Bahamas, poor soil, poorer luck. Its main town of Nassau burned twice in 3 years by combined French and Spanish raiding fleets. The 1703 raid was the worst of the two. The invaders spiked the guns of the fort, carried off the governor in chains, and put the town to the torch, and when a second raid finished the job 3 years later, most of the surviving settlers gave up and left for Carolina, or the smaller out islands. The proprietors in England who technically owned the Bahamas stopped sending governors worth the name. What remained was a scatter of roofless shacks along a white sand beach, gardens going back to scrub, a ruined stone fort with its guns dismounted and rusting in the salt air, and one of the finest natural harbors in the Americas, sitting empty. For years, the loudest sound in Nassau was the surf. They had no idea what that emptiness was worth, because the geography of Nassau Harbor reads like a checklist written by a smuggler. A long barrier island, Hog Island, shelters the anchorage from the open Atlantic. The water inside is deep enough for the fast sloops raiders favored, but a sandy bar across the approaches runs too shallow for the big men of war the Royal Navy would need to send against it. 2 separate entrances meant a trapped ship always had a back door. There was fresh water, timber, high ground for a lookout, and beyond the horizon the Florida Straits, the funnel through which nearly every treasure ship and merchant convoy leaving the Caribbean for Europe had to pass. A fortress the defenders never had to build. The men who understood this first were not romantic rebels. They were the unemployed muscle of a world war. For over a decade, England had fought Spain and France in the War of the Spanish Succession, and both sides had licensed privateers, private warships, legally authorized to plunder enemy trade. Then, in 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht ended the war, and the licenses died with it. Thousands of experienced fighting sailors were dumped onto the docks of Port Royal and Bristol, with no wages and one marketable skill. Some of them kept doing the job without the paperwork. A hard core of them drifted to that empty harbor in the Bahamas. One of the first names in the record is Benjamin Hornigold. Starting around the winter of 1713, Hornigold and a few dozen men worked out of Nassau in periaguas, oversized sailing canoes, snapping up Spanish trading vessels around the Florida Straits and hauling the cargo back to the beach. He insisted, for years, that he was no pirate at all. In his own mind, he was still a privateer, still fighting Spain, and he made it a rule never to attack an English ship. Hold on to that rule. It will come back to decide his career. There was even a lawman, of a kind. Thomas Walker, a former colonial official, lived on the island and actually tried to enforce the king's law against the newcomers, seizing stolen goods and sending complaints to distant governors. The pirates threatened his life, and by 1716, Walker had loaded his family into a boat and fled. From that point on, the only law on New Providence was whatever the men with the guns agreed among themselves. And within months, they would be richer than anyone thought possible. Because on the night of July 31st, 1715, the Spanish treasure system met a hurricane in the Florida Straits. The annual treasure fleet, 11 ships heavy with the silver of an empire, had sailed late from Havana into the heart of the storm season. In the black hours of the morning, the wind swung onshore and drove the fleet onto the reefs and sandbars of the Florida coast, and the ships came apart in the breakers within sight of land. Around 1,000 sailors and passengers drowned in a single night. Survivors crawled onto a bare, mosquito-ridden coastline and dug for water while the wreckage of an entire treasure convoy washed up around them. And the silver, millions of pesos of it, came to rest in water shallow enough that a diver could reach it on one breath. Spain rushed salvage crews to the wreck sites and stacked the recovered coin in a camp on the beach under a small guard. Word of that camp traveled through every tavern in the Caribbean, and it changed the story completely. Henry Jennings, an English privateer captain out of Jamaica, decided the salvage camp was a prize like any other. In early 1716, with 3 vessels and a few hundred men, Jennings landed on the Florida beach, ran off the Spanish guards, and emptied the treasure storehouse. The Spanish accounting put the loss at roughly 87,000 pieces of eight. England and Spain were at peace, which made the raid piracy, plain and simple, and Jamaica could no longer shelter him. So Jennings sailed his stolen silver to the one port with no governor, no garrison, and no questions: Nassau. That was only round 1. Jennings and his captains went back for more, and other crews harried the Spanish salvage operation for months, until the wreck sites of the 1,715 fleet had become a free-for-all, pulling every ambitious sailor in the western Atlantic toward the Bahamas. The silver hit that beach like a flood tide. Traders sailed in from the American colonies to buy plundered cargo at a discount. No paperwork requested. Taverns went up, and where lumber ran short, men raised a shanty town of driftwood, palm thatch, and old sailcloth along the harbor front. Tent ropes strung between the ruins of the old colony. Fences, smugglers, tailors, and prostitutes followed the money. Wreckers dove the treasure ships by day and drank their pesos by night, and every out-of-work sailor between Boston and Barbados heard the same rumor. There was an island where the trade paid in silver, and nobody hanged for it. Within a year, the pirates and their hangers-on outnumbered the honest inhabitants many times over. The men at the center of it began calling themselves the Flying Gang. One of them, a Jamaican named Thomas Barrow, went further. A sworn deposition from 1,716 records Barrow declaring himself governor of Providence, boasting that the island would be made a second Madagascar, a pirate kingdom in open water. There was no election behind that title, and no office behind the boast. But the fact that a wanted man felt safe saying it, out loud, to witnesses, tells you what Nassau had already become. Power on the island settled into loose factions around the 2 biggest names in the harbor: Hornigold, the careful ex-privateer who still would not touch an English ship, and Jennings, the Florida raider who had made everyone rich, and the 2 men reportedly could not stand each other. Yet the town never tore itself apart over it. The crews had another way of settling who led whom. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Because the thing that actually governed Nassau was not a governor at all. It was paperwork. Before a pirate crew sailed from Nassau, the men drew up and signed a written contract. They called them articles. Copies and reconstructions of these documents survive from the era in trial records and printed accounts, and they read like the bylaws of a trading company. The plunder was divided in fixed shares, spelled out in advance. An ordinary hand got 1 share. The captain typically got a share and a half, sometimes 2, and no more. Think about that ratio for a second. On a merchant ship of the same period, the captain might earn 10 times what a sailor did and could flog him for talking back. On a pirate ship, the boss made 50% more than the newest man aboard, and he answered to him. The articles that survive go further. They set out injury compensation, a fixed payment from the common fund for a lost leg, a lost arm, a lost eye, scaled by the severity of the wound, decades before any navy on Earth offered its sailors anything like it. They banned gambling for money aboard some ships, set lights-out hours below deck, required every man to keep his pistols and cutlass clean and ready for action, and laid down how disputes were settled. In articles recorded from the era, striking another man aboard was forbidden outright. Quarrels waited for the next landfall, where the 2 men settled it ashore, face to face, under the eye of the quartermaster. Order on the ship came first, because the ship was the whole country these men had. Break the articles and a jury of your shipmates decided your punishment: marooning for desertion, death for bringing a hidden woman aboard on some cruise. Every man signed, and everyone who signed had a vote, and the vote had teeth. A pirate captain held absolute authority only in 2 situations: chasing a prize and fighting one. Everywhere else, the big decisions, where to cruise, what to attack, when to go home, belonged to the majority of the crew. Day to day, the men were run not by the captain but by the quartermaster, a second officer the crew elected specifically as a counterweight, the man who controlled the plunder, the provisions, and the discipline. A captain who turned tyrant, or timid, or unlucky, could be voted out of the job on the open ocean. If that sounds like theory, watch it happen to the most respected pirate in Nassau. Through 1,715 and 1,716, Benjamin Hornigold ran the largest operation on the island, and he mentored the man history would remember better than any of them, a tall Bristol-born sailor named Edward Thatch, spelled a half-dozen ways in the records, the future Blackbeard. Hornigold taught Thatch the trade in those same waters, gave him his first commands, and watched him grow from a capable deckhand into the most naturally gifted raider on the island, a man who understood before anyone else that terror, managed carefully, was cheaper than gunpowder. But Hornigold still clung to his old privateer's rule: no English prizes, ever. His men watched fat English merchantmen sail past unmolested, and in November of 1716 they had enough. The crew called a vote on his own deck and removed him from command, choosing a captain willing to rob every flag on the sea. The most feared name in the harbor, fired by a show of hands. The lawless chaos of legend did not do that. A functioning system did. Now, before this turns into a recruiting poster, the same records cut the other way, and this channel does not trim evidence to fit a story. Nassau's crews included free black sailors. Some of them escaped slaves, living and fighting and voting alongside white shipmates in an era when that was almost unthinkable. And that is documented. So is this. When pirate crews captured slave ships, they sometimes freed the human cargo into the crew, and they sometimes sold it, because slaves were valuable plunder, and Nassau's markets were not choosy. The island offered an escaped man a better chance at freedom than almost anywhere else in the Americas. It was not a principle, it was an opening. Both facts are true at once, and an honest history holds both. By 1717, the system was working terrifyingly well. The best estimates that survive put the pirate population of New Providence at around 1,000 men, and some contemporaries claimed far more, operating dozens of vessels across the sea lanes of an empire. The damage reads plainly in the letters of colonial governors: Bermuda reporting its trade nearly at a standstill, South Carolina describing ships taken within sight of its own coast, Virginia's governor calling the Bahamas a nest of pirates and pleading for warships. Merchant sailings were delayed or canceled outright, cargoes lost, and the cost of insuring a Caribbean voyage climbed with every capture. A sail flying no colors on the horizon could empty a harbor of outbound shipping for a week. The pirates rarely needed to fire a broadside. A shot across the bow and a black flag run up the halyard did the work, because every merchant crew in those waters had heard exactly what resistance cost. In May of 1718, a Nassau graduate showed just how far the reach extended, when Blackbeard, now commanding a captured French slaver rebuilt into the 40-gun Queen Anne's Revenge, blockaded the entire port of Charleston, South Carolina, for nearly a week, seizing ships and hostages, while one of the richest towns in English America simply endured it. Two empires watched a beach full of sacked sailors strangle their commerce, and for years, neither could reach them. London finally moved, and it moved with a document instead of a fleet. On the 5th of September, 1717, King George I issued a royal proclamation offering the king's pardon. Any pirate who surrendered to a governor within the deadline would walk free of every act of piracy he had committed. It was a cold and brilliant piece of statecraft, designed to do what the Navy could not: split the Brotherhood in half. Word reached Nassau by the end of the year, and in February of 1718, the warship Phoenix anchored off the harbor to take names. Hundreds of pirates signed, Hornigold among them, some from weariness, some from calculation, and more than a few intending to pocket the pardon and keep the trade. A pirate with a pardon in his sea chest was a free man in every English port on earth, and after years of living, one capture away from a rope, plenty of hard men found that paper heavier than any share of silver. For weeks the island split down the middle, pardoned men and holdouts drinking in the same taverns, each side calling the other fools, while the captains of the Phoenix's boats rode lists of surrendered names back and forth across the harbor. The hard men refused outright, and the loudest of the holdouts was a veteran of Jennings' old Florida raid, a captain with a documented taste for cruelty, even by the standards of his profession, Charles Vane. The pardoned men celebrated their clean slates. They should not have. The paper that forgave them came with a second page, and it was written on a gallows. If you want more evidence-first pirate history like this, hit subscribe. Powder Monkeys separates what the records prove from what the legends added. One Golden Age story at a time. Enter Woodes Rogers. If London had ordered a man built for this job, it could not have done better. Rogers was a Bristol sea captain who had led a privateering voyage around the entire world, fought a Spanish galleon off the coast of Mexico, and taken a musket ball through the jaw doing it. Along the way, he rescued a castaway named Alexander Selkirk from an uninhabited island, the marooned sailor, whose story fed the novel Robinson Crusoe. Rogers came home famous, lost his fortune anyway, and then talked the government into an appointment nobody sane wanted: Captain General and Governor of the Bahamas, with orders to take the pirate republic apart. He sailed with a small squadron, a few Royal Navy escorts, his own armed merchantman, the Delicia, a company of soldiers, over 100 settlers with tools and provisions to rebuild the colony, and a stack of pardon forms. Rogers was not coming to raid the island. He was coming to keep it. On the 24th of July, 1718, his ships raised New Providence. What happened over the next 2 nights became the dividing line of the whole story. Charles Vane had no intention of surrendering, but he was anchored inside a harbor that was filling with the king's ships. So he wrote to Rogers first, a letter demanding, as if between equals, that he be allowed to keep his plunder as the price of his submission. Rogers did not answer, and in the darkness that followed, Vane gave his reply. His men took a captured French prize, packed her with powder and shot, set her ablaze, and sent her drifting down on the Royal Squadron. She came down the anchorage after midnight, a wall of flame on the black water, her loaded guns cooking off in the heat and firing blind in every direction, and the Navy escorts cut their cables and clawed out of the channel to save themselves. Behind the fireship, in the confusion, Vane ran his own sloop out through the shallow eastern channel that big ships could not follow, the black flag up, firing as he went, and vanished into the night sea. It was the most defiant single act in the history of the Republic. It was also the moment the Republic's fate was sealed, because everyone left on the beach chose not to follow him. The next morning, Woodes Rogers came ashore to a scene nobody in London would have believed. Hundreds of pirates lined the path from the beach, drawn up in 2 ragged ranks like a guard of honor, firing their muskets into the air in salute, with Benjamin Hornigold, the pardoned founder of the whole enterprise, among those welcoming the new governor in. At the gate of the ruined fort, Rogers had his royal commission read aloud to the assembled crowd, the words of the king carrying over a beach full of men the king had sworn to hang, and the pirate republic ended, on paper, right there, with a ceremony where everyone had expected a battle. The men who had made the island infamous cheered the man sent to bury it. Paper is one thing. The island was another. The colony Rogers took over was a wreck, and within weeks a fever swept through his people and killed dozens of his soldiers and settlers, while the Navy escorts he depended on sailed off for better duty. Food ran short. The new government of the Bahamas was, for a while, a sick camp behind a broken wall, and the pardoned men of Nassau, watching that government sicken, began to drift back toward the old trade. Boats slipped out. Prizes were taken. Every relapse was a test of whether the governor's word meant anything, and Rogers knew exactly how that test had to be answered. He commissioned pirate hunters from among the pardoned, and the man he trusted most was Hornigold, the old commodore now carrying the king's paper against his former brethren. In the last weeks of 1718, Hornigold ran down a crew of relapsed pirates under a captain named John Auger at Exuma and dragged them back to Nassau in chains, which, depending on where you stood on that waterfront, was either the ultimate betrayal or the first proof that law had actually arrived. What followed was the point of no return. In early December 1718, Rogers convened a court in Nassau, and 10 men were tried for piracy committed after taking the pardon. 9 were condemned. On the 12th of December, on the waterfront where the flying gang had drunk its stolen silver, 8 of them were hanged in front of the assembled town, the crowd thick with men who had sailed under the same black flags and taken the same pardon. Rogers had so little force at his disposal that he armed pardoned pirates to guard the scaffold, and by his own account, he half expected the crowd to rush it. Nobody moved. One report has a condemned man kicking off his shoes at the gallows to break a boast that he would die with them on. A single prisoner, a young sailor named George Rouncevelle, was reprieved at the last moment. Nobody watching missed the message. The pardon was real, and so was the rope. By then, the wider war on the Brotherhood was already collecting its famous names. 3 weeks before the Nassau hangings, on the 22nd of November, 1718, Blackbeard himself was cornered at Ocracoke Inlet on the Carolina coast by a Royal Navy boarding party under Lieutenant Robert Maynard, and died fighting on his own deck, shot and cut down in a close-quarters melee that became legend within a year. The Navy sailed home with his severed head hanging from a bowsprit, a trophy and a message in one. The greatest name Nassau ever produced had outlived the republic that trained him by exactly 4 months. Charles Vane, the man who had burned his answer to the king into the night sky over Nassau, lasted longer. His own crew eventually deposed him by vote for refusing a fight, the republic's rules following him to the end. Wrecked in a hurricane and recognized by an old acquaintance, he was carried to Port Royal, tried, and hanged in 1721, unrepentant in the records to the last. And Hornigold, the founder turned hunter, disappears from the story around 1719, most accounts pointing to a shipwreck, though the records of his death are thin enough that even that ending stays uncertain. So put the myth on trial. The story says pirates were chaos, savagery without order, the opposite of civilization. The documents from Nassau say otherwise. Written contracts a man signed before he sailed, fixed wages of a kind, injury insurance, elected officers, recorded votes that removed the most powerful captains in the harbor, discipline stricter, in some articles, than the Navy chasing them, enforced on men who had chosen it rather than been pressed into it. That part of the legend fails the evidence, completely, but run the test in the other direction, because the modern counter-myth fails it too. The Republic of Pirates never called itself a republic. It wrote no constitution, held no assembly, built no courts, and it fed itself by armed robbery and, when convenient, the selling of human beings. What the records actually prove is narrower and stranger than either story. A few thousand of the least free men of their age, deserters, cast-offs, debtors, and escaped slaves, built the most democratic ships afloat and anchored them in a town with no government at all. The order lived on the water, in the articles, and it never made the jump to land. Maybe it never could have. The system ran on plunder, and plunder needs an empire to bleed, and empires eventually notice. It lasted barely 12 years. In the summer of 1717, 1,000 pirates ruled that harbor, and the empire could only watch. 18 months later, the harbor was quiet, the fort was being rebuilt, and the only pirates on the waterfront were the 8 left hanging as a lesson. The empire reclaimed the island. It never quite reclaimed the story, and the story is the one thing Nassau never surrendered. The trials, the wrecks, and the hunts that ended the Golden Age are each their own episode, and they are told on this channel the same way, from the records outward. The next one is on screen now.